In 1889, by unanimous vote of a Universalist ordaining council of 3 ministers, Joseph Jordan became the first African-American minister in the Universalist denomination. Jordan, born in 1842 as a free man in Norfolk, Virginia, had built himself a successful career as a carpenter, a home builder, and then a property owner, the latter of which made him financially independent. Devoutly religious, he was also a Baptist minister until 1880, when a colleague gave him a copy of a book called The Plain Guide to Universalism. Well, Jordan read the book, and he was converted to this idea that a loving God intended love for all people, and that in the end, no one would be condemned to hell, but that God's love would win out and reclaim everybody. He left the Baptist church to become better acquainted with this new religion of universalism. He studied, he read widely, he traveled to a Universalist church in Philadelphia where he was mentored by a Universalist minister, and then he returned to Norfolk, Virginia, where he built his own pulpit, literally, and began to preach God's universal love. Now, Jordan's church was successful in attracting a flock, but Jordan had a difficult task because he had to convince an audience, a congregation of African Americans in the Deep South during the height of the Jim Crow era, that God loved the oppressive white landholder just as much as them. Or at the very least, that none of these white people were going to hell. He also had to sell black people on the Universalist church, which at the time was mostly white and segregationist at the national level. So it was a tough sell. But we must assume that Jordan was both passionate and persuasive because the church grew. Jordan added a school that attracted a lot of children, and eventually he planted a sister congregation in Suffolk, Virginia, and he kept the ministry going until his death in 1901. Now, unfortunately, the Norfolk church did not long survive the passing of its devoted founder. But the Suffolk church was taken over by Joseph Fletcher Jordan, no relation, who was the third African-American ordained into the Universalist church. And the Suffolk church had a long life in that community until finally closing in 1984. But as the only black Universalist minister in the Deep South, in the entire South, Joseph Fletcher Jordan had all he could do to keep his own church and school going. There was no possibility of expanding the reach of this message of universal love deeper into the African American community. Joseph Jordan was a pioneer who brought the religion of universalism into a new community. Joseph Fletcher Jordan was also a pioneer. One wonders what could have been if the Universalists as a body had shared their vision and sustained that commitment to reaching out to African Americans. Until late into the 20th century, that interest was not there. Now, just a few years before Joseph Jordan made his life-changing discovery of universalism, Egbert Ethelred Brown was born in Jamaica in 1875. As a young man, he became a prosperous civil servant in Jamaica, but was unexpectedly and unexplainedly dismissed from his job. And although this was a devastating blow for the young man, Ethelred decided to take it as a sign of providence, and he turned to the ministry. And specifically, he turned to the Unitarian ministry, because although he had been raised a Methodist, one day in a moment of sudden illuminating theological clarity, he realized that the Methodist doctrine of the Trinity did not make any sense to him, and he no longer believed it. And so he became a Unitarian. After several failed initial attempts to get from Jamaica to New York, to America, Ethelred landed in New York in 1910 as a student at Meadville Theological Seminary, and he was ordained as the first black Unitarian minister in 1912. So Ethelred Brown first took Unitarianism back to Jamaica to plant a new church at home. But this overseas mission received very little support from the American Unitarian Association, the national body, which at that time was never able to bring itself to really believe that black people could have any interest in Unitarianism. So the church struggled. Ethelred Brown moved his family to New York in 1920, and he founded the Harlem Community Church. And there he preached a Unitarian humanism that blended free-thinking religion with activism and politics, radical politics. The church also served as a community center for radical black thought and for organizing. His vision was for the church to be, in his words, a temple and a forum. A temple and a forum. An article in a Jamaican newspaper at that time noted admirably that Reverend Ethelred Brown's name has become synonymous with religious radicalism. An amazing number of thought-provoking topics are analyzed and discussed every Sunday night, it said. It would be nothing strange, the newspaper account continued, to walk in on a Sunday night while the complexion of the Christ Savior was being discussed. Or the topic might be straw in the land of the Pharaohs and cotton in Alabama. That article is taken from the book Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism, edited by Mark Morrison Reed. Well, Brown's Harlem Church was also never well supported by the American Unitarian Association. He struggled financially, having to support himself and his family with a series of additional jobs. He was an elevator operator for 6 years, which job he hated. And his family suffered deeply from his overwork and from his poverty. And Brown's personal life involved a lot of family tragedy. Nonetheless, he kept church going through all of it. A temple and a forum for progressive African Americans, which lasted through the Harlem Renaissance, the Depression, World War II, and on into the 1950s. Ethelred Brown was a pioneer who brought Unitarianism into a new community. One wonders what he could have accomplished if the American Unitarian Association had had any real interest in supporting a black-led Unitarian church in Harlem at that time. By the end of the 1940s, there were only 5 African-American ministers in the entire Unitarian church. African-American ministries in the early 20th century were discouraged by the national body. When Louis McGee, a longtime humanist and a Unitarian who was also African-American, sought ordination, he was told he would have to create his own church if he wanted to serve one, because the Unitarian Association was not going to plant him with a white congregation. Nonetheless, McGee enrolled in the Unitarian Seminary, and he went on to found the Free Religious Fellowship in Chicago, followed by many other successful congregations. He, too, was an exception, a pioneer. And throughout the 19th and 20th century of Unitarianism and Universalism, historian the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed notes that the two denominations, Universalism, Unitarianism, vacillated between indifference and hostility to the idea of attracting widespread support in the African American community. The churches that did exist were the result of pioneers like Jordan, Brown, and McGee, who took great risks and paid a heavy personal price in terms of overwork and poverty. Nonetheless, Morrison Reed also has noted that many African American lay people were moving into positions of leadership in white UU churches, beginning in the 1940s and on into the 1960s. 10% of UU churches had black Unitarians on their boards of trustees and in similar leadership positions at this time. And this was because after World War II, a new era of Unitarian and Universalist leadership were finally turning their attention to the issues of racial injustice in America and making an effort to engage with these issues. In 1942, the Unitarians passed a general resolution condemning racism. In 1952, the great African-American minister, the Reverend Howard Thurman, was invited to be the Ware lecturer, the keynote speaker at our annual General Assembly. In 1963, the Unitarians rejected a proposal that would have required all UU churches to desegregate because they believed that requirement would violate local church independence and congregational polity. But 2 years later, more UU ministers answered the call to join Dr. King at Selma than from any other denomination. And in 1966, Dr. King himself delivered the Ware Lecture, the annual keynote address at General Assembly. Our history then, in the second half of the 20th century, was moving fitfully but with accelerating speed towards a commitment to racial justice. We'd gone from being two separate denominations, the Universalists and the Unitarians, each with their own long history of institutional racism and neglect, into one new Unitarian Universalist association founded in 1961, which was finding its way into a new vision. It was a denomination, however, that was also slow to wake up to the presence of a great many passionate, politically engaged, newly empowered, and fiercely self-determined black people in its midst. The Reverend Mark Morrison Reed recounts his own father's frustration at dealing with white racial cluelessness in his home UU congregation in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. So this again is from Darkening the Doorways. He writes, "My dad was participating in a church meeting in which black people and white people were discussing race, and what he heard annoyed him so much that he stood up and said, 'Listen, you white folks can walk out of here and you can do whatever you want. We walk out of here and we are still black. You can do whatever you want and we can't.' And later he said, 'I'll never forget how cavalier their attitude was. It was like it was no big deal, and somehow the Civil Rights Act had changed everything.' It hadn't." So in the tumultuous aftermath of Dr. King's murder, when the inner cities across America exploded into protest, the Unitarian Universalist Association, with a combination of hubris and naivete, called an emergency conference on the Unitarian Universalist response to the Black Rebellion. That's what they called it, the Emergency Conference on the Unitarian Universalist response to the Black Rebellion. 150 attendees gathered at the Biltmore Hotel in New York. 37 of the delegates were African American Unitarian Universalists. And one of them recalled the attitude that still prevailed in the denomination was epitomized by the meeting itself. No one had asked the African American leadership if they wanted such a meeting. No one had asked them how to run it. No one had asked them who to invite. No one had asked them what its name should be. And suffice to say, the Emergency Conference on the Black Rebellion would not have been high on their list of names. Reverend Morrison Reed notes that African Americans represented 1% of UUs nationally at that time, but they represented 25% of the delegates to the Emergency Conference. So when they got there and they saw their own numbers for the first time, the first thing they did was to withdraw to their own space. And they held an emergency meeting of their own. And they then surprised the white delegates, the white leadership, with a list of non-negotiable demands coming from the newly formed Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus. Because this was the era of black power and black self-determination. And they had their own ideas about what the black community needed and what response was called for. And one of their demands was $1 million from the Unitarian Universalist Association to be paid over 4 years and directed towards the black community, and the black community itself would decide what to do with that money. Thank you very much. Now, this sudden paradigm shift from an ethic of integration to an ethic of black self-determination sent shockwaves through the UUA leadership, who viewed themselves as good white liberals and were surprised and hurt by the accusation that maybe they were also part of the problem. Non-negotiable demands seem to go against the democratic spirit of Unitarian Universalism. It is not how we do things. And as one of the black organizers later said, if you wanted to make a white UU absolutely crazy, just close a door and tell them there is a discussion going on back there and you are not allowed in. So the events that followed were very complex, with a lot of players and a lot of different agendas and many groups with acronyms because UUs love acronyms. And there were a lot of competing opinions about what happened after that and what it all meant exactly. But the upshot is this. At two incredibly contentious General Assemblies or national meetings in 68 and 69, after a walkout by the black delegates, followed by a solidarity walkout by the white ministers, literally half the assembly got up and left and went to a hotel across the street, the UUA eventually voted through the General Assembly to award the Black UU Caucus the money that it was demanding. Then, the UUA board discovered, to their surprise and to their dismay, that the outgoing president had basically bankrupted the association, and there was in fact very little money to be had anywhere. The award was reduced. The award was reduced. And in the process of all of this, relationships were damaged very badly, and many black Unitarian Universalists lost trust in the institution, and they left the religion. If you want to learn more about these events, there's a lot of good resources online. I'll be happy to point you toward them. But suffice to say, it was one of the hardest and saddest episodes in Unitarian Universalist history. Now, in the decades that followed, the UUA found its way slowly back to racial justice work and to a new understanding of what it means to be an anti-racist religious movement. And the dedicated work of African-American luminaries like Paula Cole Jones and Mel Hoover kept the spirit alive, working within the institution. Some of the African-American UUs who had left the movement in anger and sorrow eventually found their way back. One of them was the Reverend Bill Sinkford, who became the first black president of the UUA in 2001. And in 1997, at General Assembly, the UUA adopted by a near unanimous vote a resolution called Journey Towards Wholeness, which spelled out a new commitment to racial justice for the denomination. And the language of journeying towards wholeness is echoed in the proposed eighth principle, which Paula Cole Jones helped author, and you can find the text of that on the back of your bulletin. So fast forward just a little bit now. In 2015, in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and the Ferguson Uprising, a group of young African-American UUs met together in Cleveland, Ohio at an event called the Movement for Black Lives Convening, which was a general gathering of young black leaders and activists from all across the nation in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. They all landed in Cleveland, Ohio. And about a dozen of these activists who'd come to Cleveland were UUs, and they found each other. And sitting around a table, surrounded by hundreds of black activists working for a more just world, they began to dream of what, in their words, a cohesive, national, vibrant community of black Unitarian Universalists could look like. While many challenges and personal experiences were shared, they remembered, one thing stood out for all of us. Our Unitarian Universalist faith is what calls us to say that black lives matter. And they longed to create a home for the expression of that faith within black community. And carrying the memory of that event and that longing with them, 5 of them continued the conversation by email and Facebook and phone, and they formed themselves into an organizing collective for a group that they called the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. Their first act was to create and publish a document called 7 Principles of Black Lives, a response to the UU 7 Principles through the lens of black experience and black theology. So Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, BLUU, Blue as they are now called, then worked with the UUA to facilitate nearly 100 black UUs from all around the country attending the 2016 General Assembly, who normally would never have been able to attend. And the goal of Blue was to get as many black Unitarian Universalists as possible who are normally spread out across the country and isolated in mostly white congregations, to get them together in one space so they could feel the magic and the power and the possibility that they had when they were together. So at GA, they held a series of very powerful racial justice workshops that were open to everybody. I was there for them. But also they created what they called explicitly black spaces for African American UUs to gather in. That year, Blue also led the closing worship at General Assembly, bringing what they called an unapologetically black theological and musical lens to the forms of UU worship. And I was there for that too, and it was amazing. And what happened next is historic in our faith. Members of the Black Lives of UU organizing collective met with the UUA leadership, and they asked them for $5 million in funding to secure the future of their work. And it had been 50 years since the UUA had promised to give what was then called the Black Affairs Council the funding that they had asked for, and then broken that promise. And in 2016, the UUA board, mindful of that history, kept the promise and voted to guarantee funding for the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. And since 2016, Blue has carried out a remarkable body of work implementing their mission and their vision. They held a national convening for Black UUs in New Orleans. They have organized regular online worship and pastoral care. They asked people in the community, African American UUs, what do you most want? And they thought they were going to say, we want social justice, we want activism. They didn't say that. They said, we want pastoral care. We want spiritual care. We want worship. We need to be able to speak to our concerns as African Americans and get UU spiritual care, because that's what they want. So Blue is making that available to them. In 2018, they hosted an online panel discussion called Whose Faith Is It Anyway? Envisioning a future vision for Black Unitarian Universalism. And in 2019, they held their first ever theology symposium, open to all, called the Harper-Jordan Memorial Symposium, named after Joseph Jordan, the first Black Universalist minister, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a pioneering journalist and civil rights crusader. And the symposium, over several days of worship and dialogue and panel discussions, explored the question of what a UU theology fully engaged with the Black experience might become. I attended the symposium as a virtual attendant, as did Suzanne, our Director of Lifespan Religious Education. I can tell you it was powerful and powerfully thought-provoking event. And I can tell you that these are some of the most brilliant and dedicated and passionate future leaders within Unitarian Universalism. They're setting the course for the future of our religious movement and what it means for us to be a truly inclusive, welcoming, radical, loving space. Symposium's available for streaming online if you want to experience it yourself for a small fee. So 140 years ago, Joseph Jordan was so powerfully attracted to our universalist message of a love that heals and holds and embraces and redeems all people, that he left the life he knew and he dedicated himself to bringing this message to the African American community because he knew the power of our theology and he knew the power of our message of love. And Ethelred Brown and the other early African American pioneers, they knew that our way of doing religion that harnesses reason and freedom and love has the power to change the world, to topple old oppressions and turn the world around. And today, the inheritors of that pioneering work, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, today their mission statement reads, Black Lives of UU harnesses love's power to combat oppression and foster healing as a spiritual and political imperative. We know the power of love to be life-changing, inclusive, relational, uncomfortable, unconditional, and without end. We know the power of love to be without end. May that mission be our mission, and may we also be a part of that life-changing, inclusive, unconditional love without end. Blessed be. Ashe. Amen.